Hello again, everybody. This is Steve Callis, speaking of sports, and we're here to talk about the recent indictment of 27 horse trainers, veterinarians, and drug suppliers in a scheme of dispensing misbranded and adulterated PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs, that were given to horses many times in many states, and even some in Dubai. We're going to talk about, there are 4 separate indictments. We're going to talk about the main indictment, which is a 43-page indictment with about 20 defendants. And the 2 main defendants are well-known trainers Jorge Navarro and Jason Service. Now, you probably know the name Jason Service. This year, he was the trainer of Maximum Security. And for those of you who really follow horse racing or even just the Kentucky Derby, you know that Maximum Security won the Kentucky Derby. And after a very long time, he was disqualified. It never happened in the 150-year or so history of the Kentucky Derby. It was very controversial. Just a side note, the New York Times actually came out on their website with Maximum Security wins the Derby. And of course, they had to take it down a few minutes later. I guess the guy writing it didn't realize there was an inquiry or an objection. But, you know, that's to me now kind of the Dewey defeats Truman of horse racing, if not sports, because it's the Kentucky Derby. In any event, Maximum Security went on to have a great season after that. And he actually recently, in the last 2 weeks, won a $20 million race in Saudi Arabia, the richest race in the history of horse racing anywhere, at any time, at any place. And now there are, of course, severe questions about whether he was drugged in all of these races. And the reason there are severe questions is because it's called the Navarro indictment because he's the first defendant, but Service admits, and I'm going to read you some quotes from these indictments. Service admits that he essentially had used an illegal drug called SFG 1000 on virtually all of his horses. And people went back and with the timing of the indictment, he had raced 1,082 times. So if he said virtually all, you know, what are you going to guess? He did it 1,000 times. Again, as you know, an indictment is only allegations, but the crux of this case, to me, are the many quotes, some of which I will read shortly, but are the many quotes on intercepted phone calls, which means somehow they got a wiretap. The government had enough to present to a judge. Wiretaps were put in place, and they got some pretty damning evidence, and I'm going to read you some right now. There are many other defendants, but Navarro and Service are probably the 2 certainly most prominent horsemen to be indicted. But I do want to read to give you a flavor, because the problems in these cases is there's often problems of proof, but in this case, they have some pretty incredible admissions on tape. Of course, those will be challenged, but that's for down the road. So let me just give you a flavor. And again, there's 4 indictments. But I just want to read you some of the things that were caught on tape. And I guess you can still say allegedly, but this means the government has them on tape. The first one is there's a harness trainer named Nick Zurich, who certainly doesn't have the best reputation at the harness track. I don't know what his, if he's had suspensions or anything. But he might be serving more time than anybody. I'll get into that. Or he's certainly accused of crimes that will, if convicted, give him more time than anybody. I'll get into that in a minute. But this is a quote from Nick Zurich, who's a harness guy, talking about what he's done for Jorge Navarro, who is a thoroughbred guy. So it's interesting. You don't see a lot of crossover usually, once in a while, but not too much. Here's what Nick Zurich said in a phone call, intercepted phone call, on February 1st of this year, according to the indictment. Quote, and the language is very blunt here, I'm just going to read it. Quote, you know how many fucking horses Navarro fucking killed and broke down that I made disappear? You know how much trouble he could get in if they found out the 6 horses we killed? Now, that's pretty incredible stuff. Now, he's obviously not saying that to Navarro, so he's saying that on the line with somebody else, and of course you know that Navarro is going to deny all of that stuff. But there are a few other quotes that I'll just read you right out of the, that's at page 14 of the Navarro indictment, and we'll have links to the indictments along with this video, so you can just click on if you want to read the indictment. Again, this one's 43 pages, but if you want to read the indictments for yourself, it's always not a bad idea to go to the source to see exactly what the government is charging. This is from page 28 of the Navarro indictment, and this is Service, a top trainer, recommending to Navarro, a top trainer, this SGF 1000. Now, when I say adulterated and misbranded PEDs, what that means is they illegally changed the content, or they said it was a legal drug that was being given to the horse when it was in fact. They misbranded it to make it a legal drug, and they actually got some vets to fill out that they injected this horse with this legal drug when in fact it was something else. But here's Service recommending to Navarro this SGF, and he stated, quote, "I've been using it on everything almost," close quote. So that's where the 1,082 starts over the lifespan of the indictment. You can guess 1,000 if he used it on almost everything. Navarro stated on that call that he, quote, got more than 12 horses on, quote, SGF 1000, and shortly after ended the call, quote, "I don't want to talk about this shit on the phone, okay?" So obviously it's a little too late for that particular phone call. Maybe he should have said that in the first sentence as opposed to the last, but that's pretty damning testimony. And again, these are between two of the top trainers in the country. Finally, Christian Rhine, R-H-E-I-N, is a defendant who is a licensed veterinarian. And this is Rhine, the vet, talking to Service, the top trainer, about whether or not a drug can be, whether or not there's a test for a drug. As you know, the Olympics, Lance Armstrong, horse trainers, there's always cheaters. There's always people who are trying to stay ahead of the crowd, if you will, or certainly ahead of the testers. And it's a continuing battle. And that's been going on in horse racing for years as well. This is not new. Just the scope and breadth of this indictment is new. So Christian Rhine, the vet, is talking to Service, and here's what Christian Rhine said. This is from the indictment. Rhine counseled Service and reassured him that maximum security would not test positive. Quote, "They don't even have a test for it, meaning SGF 1000. There's no test for it in America," close quote. So again, now these are kind of the worst things I'm finding. I haven't read them all. I'm going to read you one more from another indictment. But usually, frankly, these are, and I worked at the track for a long time. I trained and drove harness horses from the late 80s into the early 2000s. If these things happen, I never had one of these conversations, but they're normally face-to-face. They're not usually done on the phone, especially if you're in a position where you should have the knowledge to know that maybe you're being wiretapped if you're doing something wrong. There's kind of an Astros analogy here that I might go into later. I'm not really sure. But, this is really damning stuff. So another defendant in a separate indictment is Louis Grasso. And in the Grasso indictment, he was talking to Thomas Guido. Thomas Guido is a harness horse trainer. From what I hear, not the greatest rep ever, but again, this is a lot more serious than you've got a bad rep. But I just want to tell you what Grasso said to Guido, referring to a certain type of PED, performance-enhancing drug, that Grasso had given to Guido, which was used to reduce bleeding in a horse's lungs during periods of exertion. That horse eventually died, and this is what Grasso said, quote, "It happens," close quote, "that the deceased horse's trainer had, quote, probably overjuiced him, close quote, and that the suspected cause of the horse's death was not unusual. Quote, I've seen that happen 20 times, close quote. So this is Louis Grasso, the lead defendant, in another of the 4 indictments, which again will all be linked underneath this video, actually just nonchalantly saying, you know, they gave him too much of this PED and a horse died, and I've seen that happen 20 times. Again, pretty damning stuff. So that's at page 10 of the Grasso indictment. So the first 3 quotes were from the Navarro indictment. That's the longer 43-page one. But this is the kind of evidence that the government has. And I would say this is pretty damning evidence. Again, you know, innocent until proven guilty. But when you have this kind of evidence, this is not somebody who's going to come in and testify, I had a conversation. And then you can try and destroy his credibility on cross. This is, the government's got tapes. You can try and fight the tapes, but usually that's pretty hard to do. So the interesting thing to me, the crime is misbranded and adulterated conspiracy. The punishment, conspiracy is a felony, but the punishment, and I think initially if all this is true, this is light, is 5 years max in prison. It's a felony, don't get me wrong, it's a serious crime, but virtually all of these defendants, including the 2 trainers, the 2 famous trainers, Service and Navarro, the most they can get is 5 years. And again, I'm not making light of that, but Nick Zurich, who is the guy we had the first quote from, there's also 2 counts against him for obstruction. And I read through that part of the 43-page indictment, and you know, he's alleged to have asked people to lie for him and cover things up. And for obstruction, there are 2 counts against Nick Zurich. He can get 20 years on each of them. So he's facing far more time than any other defendant. I just want to read to you just generally about the other indictments. Again, we've talked about the 43-page one. The Grasso one we've talked about, but there's one against Sarah Ishaki and her daughter Ashley Leibowitz for actually smuggling some of these drugs into the country. And Sarah Ishaki is also, there could be a 20-year smuggling charge against her. So, and the other one is against 2 gentlemen named Robinson and Mangini, and they're accused, neither one is a vet. One was a pharmacist in Florida who had lost his license a few years ago, and they are accused of actually making the adulterated and misbranded PEDs and then selling them on the internet. You know, you might be interested to read that one just to see how they just put it out there on the internet. And the indictment has a couple of complaints from customers who were not happy with what they got, where they say what these drugs did to their horses, and it is not a pretty picture. So look, this happens in horse racing, it happens in thoroughbred racing, it happens in harness racing. You get everybody who's in charge of racetracks, etc. Oh, you know, this is great, we have to get these people out of our business. I don't think anybody knows the true scope of how many people. One guy did say this is the tip of the iceberg. You do have a lot of people who frankly try and cheat. And I'll say it again, going back to the East Germans and all the Olympic testing for the last mid-70s till now, everybody's always trying to get an edge. There's always a whisper. Look at the baseball PEDs. We're going to do another video on A-Rod and his comments on the Astros. But another example, the PEDs and all the illegal use in baseball, where a lot of people think Major League Baseball just looked the other way. This happens a lot. I've never seen anything in a court in indictments, the scope and breadth of this. But if you're in the business, and I was in the business for a long time and still am tangentially, this is not new. This is just they got 27 people indicted, and there's going to be a lot more testing. But again, the game is always try and stay one step ahead of the testers, and they have a test for this today. You need to find this tomorrow, and then it's not going to be the next day when they find a test. And you'll see in these indictments, this is what these people do. This is what, I had never heard really of making up your own PEDs, for example. That's kind of a step beyond where it was in the 90s and early 2000s. but this is where we're going. Obviously, this is all very serious. A big black eye for horse racing, which is already under all those deaths at Santa Anita, which doesn't seem to be anything in these indictments about horses dying in Santa Anita, but that's a whole other problem. PETA's involved, and you have to worry about, I've said to many people, having worked at the track, some of these horses get treated better than human beings. And that's almost a problem for me sometimes. The horses that make a lot of money, Maximum Security has made millions of dollars. There's a horse called XY Jet that Navarro trained, who made over $3 million, was apparently given these PEDs and died of a heart attack, and that's what can happen. January of last year, I believe, that's what can happen. So obviously this should be investigated and prosecuted fully. You have to look out for the horse's best interest as well. There's no national horse racing commissioner, as there is for the other major sports. People have long called, as have I, for a national commissioner for thoroughbred racing, a national commissioner for harness racing, maybe a more single set of rules for the whole country, which they don't have now. Different states have different rules, but that's for another time. This might spring some action to have that happen, but we'll just have to see. This is a major prosecution, 4 different indictments, 27 defendants, and we'll see what happens. This is Steve Callis speaking of sports. We'll see you the next time.